Good evening, everyone. Thank you for viewing tonight's annual Philip J. Prygoski Constitution Day Address. The interactive learning and fun that comes with a packed house for this event is just one of the many casualties of the terrible pandemic we're facing this year. However, despite our physical distance, tonight's speaker is no less fascinating and his message no less urgent. But first, a word about the namesake of tonight's event. Philip J. Prygoski served as an administrative law judge for the State of Michigan Board of Licensing and Regulation, but it was the 35 years he spent teaching constitutional law at Western Michigan University Cooley Law School, mentoring countless future lawyers and judges, that was his life's work. 10 years ago, he provided invaluable support to the Romney Institute during the critical stages of its infancy. Not only was he the Institute's first speaker and fellow, delivering a bravura presentation on the First Amendment on Constitution Day 2010, he was also a constant source of wise counsel and advice. Not long after that visit to Adrian College, Professor Prygoski suffered a debilitating stroke while engaged in the craft he had mastered better than nearly anyone else, teaching constitutional law. Last fall, he passed away. To help perpetuate Professor Prygoski's legacy of curiosity and appreciation for the Constitution, the Romney Institute has invited Brett DeGroff, former criminal defense attorney and current senior law clerk to Michigan Supreme Court Justice Cavanagh, to share his thoughts on some of the most important constitutional issues facing us today. In addition to his service at the Michigan Supreme Court, Mr. DeGroff has worked for years within the Michigan criminal justice system, protecting the rights of the accused. His presentation, based on his extensive experience in the courtroom, promises to be revealing and thought-provoking. It's called Making the Words Matter: How All of Us, Not Just the Courts, Can Fulfill the Promise of the Constitution. Please join me in welcoming Brett DeGroff.
Thanks to Professor Getting for inviting me to speak with you today. Thanks generally to the school and the Romney Institute for celebrating the Constitution with this talk each year. I've been happy to attend others share their thoughts on Constitution Day in the past, so I'm thrilled to be able to share my thoughts with you all today. Thanks to you all watching online, and thanks to the very professional IT folks who are making all this happen. Obviously, we couldn't do this without you. We appreciate your help. It's sort of remarkable, I think, that we have a day to celebrate our Constitution. We have days for celebrating the founding of the country, for celebrating the people who serve in our armed forces, and for celebrating other citizens who make valuable contributions. These things are all sort of like each other. I think they all sort of make sense. Taking a moment to reflect on and honor great past presidents, to reflect on and honor people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and to think about and reflect on the people who risk their lives and who give their lives in service, seems like the least we can do for those people. Helps remind us of what they did, the ideas and principles that motivated them, and how we can continue the best parts of their legacies. That makes sense. Admittedly, Constitution Day may not get quite as much fanfare as the 4th of July, but it's still sort of remarkable. We have a day for the Constitution, for the document, for the piece of paper. It does such exciting things as taking care of in Article 6, all debts contracted and engagements entered into before the adoption of this Constitution shall be as valid against the United States under this Constitution as under the Confederation. I mean, some of this is not exactly letter from a Birmingham jail, right? I mean, the city of Adrian has a charter it's been operating under since 1957. I'm sure it's a fine document, which has served the city well, but we're not going to give it its own day. So Constitution Day. Okay, now, I know what many of you must be thinking. I can't believe he's talking about our Constitution that way. The Constitution, our Constitution, and on Constitution Day. What's he doing? He's going to ruin Constitution Day. It's okay. I'm not going to ruin Constitution Day. I was trying to activate for the purposes of this discussion, the reverence I think many people in this country have for the Constitution. Apologies to Adrian's charter, but there are bigger ideas in the Constitution, I think, and we treasure the freedoms it promises to us. I think we have a sense that the Constitution is protecting our freedom of speech, protecting our freedom of religion, freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures, and so many others. We tend to think, I think, that unconstitutional things can't happen, or if they do, courts will correct them. We have faith in the document and the systems it creates. We have faith that they will fulfill the promises that it makes. Tonight, I want to examine that idea with you and talk about what it means if it's not true. And I'll do that in 3 parts. This kind of faith or reverence that we've already talked about. Look at how some of the past promises that we think we have fulfilled have played out, and then look at what it would mean to move the ball forward in the future and how we can do that. And before I get to those 3 things, I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't take just a moment to consider the promises of the Constitution themselves and whether they are all they can be. I think if we put our heads together, we could come up with some ways in which we might want more than just effectuating what the Constitution we have does. I mean, it's not a perfect creation. It got off to sort of a poor start in Article 2, Section 1, describing the method of proportional representation when, at the time it was written, an enslaved person counted 3/5 that of an unenslaved person, and indigenous people didn't count at all. The 14th Amendment cleared some of that up in 1868, removing the 3/5 bit, but left the status of indigenous people in limbo until Congress acted in 1924 and 1965. Slavery was legal, of course, under the Constitution until the 13th Amendment in 1865, and the machinery of the Constitution is still sort of tainted by all that legacy. These systemic embodiments of racial discrimination were a compromise to mollify southern states with significant populations of enslaved people, and counting those people in these calculations, but not allowing them to vote, allowed southern states to maintain parity with northern states in the House of Representatives, and using those figures in the Electoral College allowed southern states additional influence in presidential elections. The compromise went further still in allocating seats in the Senate, not proportionally at all, but just with 2 seats to every state. And all of these things still exist, and none of them are proportional. So these are just a couple examples, and I'm sure if we all collectively put our heads together, we could imagine some other ways that maybe the Constitution could make even better promises. But nonetheless, there are many lofty and great ideas and promises in our Constitution: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures, right to a jury trial. I think Americans have a great deal of pride in these, and they feel secure in them. And maybe if I was successful in offending you a little bit when I characterized the Constitution unflatteringly at the outset, maybe you see some of that reverence and pride in yourself, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing at all. Anecdotally, I can tell you I worked as an appellate public defender, as Professor Getting said, for about 6 years, and what that means is that if you were convicted of a felony in the state of Michigan and you couldn't afford an attorney for your appeal, a court might have assigned me to your case. A criminal appeal is a really long process, and the first thing it always starts with is reading the record, which includes a transcript of every hearing and every day of trial. And the first part of every trial, first part of every jury trial, is jury voir dire, where attorneys and or the judge ask prospective jurors questions to determine whether they can be fair and unbiased. And prospective jurors are always cautioned to evaluate the testimony of police like they might anyone else, and cautioned against assuming the defendant is guilty only because he's accused. And it's worth thinking about why we have to caution jurors that way. The underlying assumption behind these questions and instructions is that people will assume police got it right, right? People have great faith in that institution. I've read a lot of transcripts, and I've never seen a judge or an attorney voir dire prospective jurors with the opposite assumption, that people just don't believe police, or that people think police get it wrong all the time. Getting ready to come speak with you, I was looking for some more concrete data than my own experiences about this idea. And I did find one web survey from 2017, which asked Americans what made them proud of their country. It was a web survey with a little over 1,000 respondents. So, I'm skeptical of how representative the sample might have been. But as support for the general propositions that Americans revere the Constitution, I think it has some weight, so I want to share just some of the results with you. Participants in the survey were asked to make two choices about what made them proud to be an American, or what they were proud of in our country. The top 5, opportunity to become who you want to be, 24%. The Constitution itself, 21%. Freedom of speech, freedom of press, 21%. Freedom of religion, 20%. Democracy, 20%. These add up to more than 100% because people made two choices. Way down the list, beauty and variety of geography and scenery. We should be proud of that, right? Only 6%. Arts and culture, only 4%. And this, I think, is a really interesting juxtaposition. Industriousness and entrepreneurial spirit, only 4%. I think that's something, in my experience, that a lot of Americans identify with. We know we're hardworking. It's a core value. But all of those things about our system of government, in this poll anyways, far exceeded it. So my takeaway is that we have this reverence for the Constitution, that it's doing its job, and this faith in just the document and the systems it creates. And I say this last example only partly in jest. Maybe the best example we have of our faith in the Constitution and the various instruments that has spawned is the healthy, let's say, respect we have for the IRS. Only two things are inevitable, right? Death and taxes. And I think most people have a sense that if you don't pay the IRS, they may not get you today, they may not get you tomorrow, but they're going to get you, and it's going to be unpleasant. Like, we think all of these things work. We assume they will, right? These things and so many others. So, why do we have this great faith in our Constitution? Maybe it's because the way we learn about our history tends to emphasize the highlights. We learn the 13th Amendment ended slavery. We learn Brown versus Board of Education desegregated schools. We learn Obergefell versus Hodges gave same-sex couples the right to marry. The way we learn about these things, it's like it just sort of happened. And I personally have a great deal of respect for President Obama and believe he's a gifted orator. And I think he played off this sense in our pride when he said things like, "Nothing can stand in the way of millions of voices calling for change." And when he quoted Dr. Martin Luther King and said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." Those are nice ideas, but I think there's some danger in plunging our heads too deeply into them. I was reading a 2018 article by Michael Denzel Smith, and he wrote that using the arc of the moral universe, quote, too loosely carries with it a danger of magical thinking. That if we think the moral universe is just going to take care of injustices we see in the world, that we don't have to make time in our own busy lives to do that work. I think that's true, and I think the same is true if you think the Constitution is going to do those things for you. So let's just talk about some of those highlights. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery in 1865. And I suppose technically we couldn't have expected the Constitution to do anything about it earlier. It was perfectly legal under the Constitution up to that point. The notion that all men are created equal is actually found in a different document, right? The Declaration of Independence. But I think it's fair to characterize the foundational thought as conflicted on this point. And I would like to think at least the seeds of the 13th Amendment were planted earlier, that maybe they were always there. But at any rate, that turn of events was far from inevitable. We fought a whole war over it. And while I think the numbers are imprecise, something like 750,000 people, 750,000 people died in the Civil War. So not inevitable. And if we're going to be honest about it, the 13th Amendment not only didn't end slavery in practice, the text of the amendment didn't even really promise to do it at all. It says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And that was a loophole quickly seized on by southern states. The except as punishment for a crime where the party shall have been duly convicted. Southern states were quick to enact labor leasing schemes whereby newly freed slaves could be convicted of relatively benign crimes such as vagrancy, and then their labor could be leased, just as if they'd never been freed at all. And if we move fast forward very quickly, past indentured servitude to segregation, racial segregation, in 1896, the Supreme Court had the chance in Plessy versus Ferguson to consider whether the 13th Amendment or the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment prohibited Louisiana from having separate train cars for black folks and white folks. And as a reminder, the 14th Amendment says in part, nor shall any state deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And when thinking about whether this meant you could sit in any train car you wanted, regardless of the color of your skin, Justice Harlan wrote, but in the view of the Constitution, in the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior, dominant, ruling class of citizens. There is no caste here. Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. The humblest is the peer of the most powerful. The law regards man as man and takes no account of his surroundings or of his color when his rights as guaranteed by the supreme law of the land are involved. And that's amazing, but it was a 7-1 decision and Justice Harlan was in the dissent. Those words didn't carry the day. No one on the court agreed with him, and the Louisiana law was upheld. And that was in 1896. And we'd have to wait until 1954, 58 years later, for the court to even think about walking that back in Brown versus Board of Education. And even then, the court didn't overrule Plessy. It did say segregated schools violated the 14th Amendment and that integration should happen with all deliberate speed. But it turned out that was much easier to say than to do. One school board in Arkansas put in a plan into place to integrate its high school by 1957, 2 years later. And when 9 kids showed up in 1957 to do just that, the governor tried to stop them, and he mobilized the Arkansas National Guard, and President Eisenhower had to federalize the National Guard so those kids could go to school. In Louisiana, Ruby Bridges attended a segregated kindergarten in 1959, 5 years after Brown. And in 1960, Ruby Bridges integrated an elementary school with federal marshals walking her to and from. Other parents didn't want their kids in the same room with her, so the one teacher that would teach Ruby Bridges sat in a room alone with her, and they carried on like there was a whole class there. And even after that, when George Wallace was elected governor of Alabama, he gave his inauguration speech in 1963, 9 years after Brown now, and said, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. In 1963, 9 years after Brown, 9 years after the ratification of the 14th Amendment, which is what was supposed to protect us from segregation in the first place, right? And we can have a whole discussion about whether integration has even been successful today. In Obergefell versus Hodges, the Supreme Court has had considerably more success implementing its holding. There, in 2015, the court held that due process and equal protections of the 14th Amendment guarantee the right of same-sex couples to marry. In Michigan, our state constitution defines marriage as between one man and one woman. So under state law, same-sex unions couldn't be recognized. But Obergefell held our state constitution was in violation of the 14th Amendment, and almost immediately, clerks began issuing marriage licenses across the state. It's worth noting, though, that even Obergefell, as successful as it was in implementation, didn't happen overnight and was far from inevitable. It was a 5-4 case, with every dissenting justice authoring his own opinion. And in the majority opinion, Justice Kennedy acknowledged how long of a road it was to get to that point. And in response to the argument that the court should let public discussion on the issue continue, this is what Justice Kennedy said. Yet there has been far more deliberation than this argument acknowledges. There have been referenda, legislative debates, and grassroots campaigns, as well as countless studies, papers, books, and other popular and scholarly writings. There's been extensive litigation in state and federal courts. Judicial opinions addressing the issue have been informed by the contentions of parties and counsel, which in turn reflect more general societal discussion of same-sex marriage and its meaning that has occurred over the past decades, as more than 100 amici make clear in their filings many of the central institutions in American life, state and local governments, the military, large and small businesses, labor unions, religious organizations, law enforcement, civic groups, professional organizations, and universities have devoted substantial attention to the question, and this has led to an understanding of the issue, an understanding reflected in the arguments now presented for the resolution as a matter of constitutional law. Which brings me back to President Obama's quotation of Dr. Martin Luther King when he said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." As Mr. Smith points out, even when King said this, he was paraphrasing an abolitionist minister, Theodore Parker, who in 1853 said, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but a little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience, and from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice." I think Parker's words are more of an expression of hope than inevitability, and it seems pretty clear that Dr. King didn't see change as inevitable. He described this country as in default on the promises of the Constitution at the March on Washington, and described that assembly as a way to collect on the promise. So, what does that mean for us today? I think it means the guarantees and promises of the Constitution are not self-executing. As wonderful and grand as the document is, it's really only a set of rules that people follow or they don't. In the end, achieving its aspirations means people make choices with those aspirations in mind and following through to make them reality. And if you want to see evidence that the document is not self-executing, I think the best would be to look at Article 1, Section 9, which reads in part, "No title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, and no person holding any office of profit or trust shall, without consent of Congress, accept of any present, emolument, office or title, or kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state. An emolument is a profit from employment or office. Uncontradicted accounts of our president refusing to divest himself of his substantial interests and repeatedly enriching those interests through his office are so common as to not even be news anymore. And the words on the paper themselves don't stop it. If you were interested in enforcing that particular provision, that would be tricky. Enforcement of that provision would probably have to happen through impeachment, and as we've seen, impeachment is a political process. Impacting it probably means impacting elections across the country, which is not to say you can't do that. You can vote in your own congressional and senatorial elections, and you should. But you can also donate to any campaign you choose. So you don't need to be a resident of Kentucky to make a difference in the McGrath-McConnell race. You don't even need to go there to knock doors. You could phone bank from right here in Michigan. But there are other examples too. You might be worried about the state of the free press. And it's true that there is an alarming and dangerous level of rhetoric about the press floating around. But to be honest, the biggest challenge to in-depth journalism today isn't government interference, at least not yet. The biggest problem is the business of journalism is struggling to move past the old business model of the newspaper, upon which so much investigative journalism is still dependent. And the biggest thing you could do to help is subscribe to a newspaper or two. You might be troubled that the Fourth Amendment protection from unreasonable searches and seizures and the 14th Amendment promise of equal protection are routinely denied to people of color, who many are realizing for the first time in recent experience that people of color experience a very different treatment from police than some white folks do. No Supreme Court case is ever going to solve this. An individual person who's wrongly convicted might have his conviction reversed through the judicial process, but that's never going to address underlying systemic problems which led to the wrongful conviction. And many of these constitutions don't result in a criminal conviction at all. So, of course, the criminal appellate process will never be concerned with them. Someone who feels like their rights were violated by police might bring a lawsuit, but lawsuits like those have to grapple with incredibly difficult procedural bars like sovereign immunity, and they're really a poor vehicle for getting at the underlying systemic problems. There's actually very little which can be done about these problems through congressional action. The federal government could stop sending military equipment to local police departments, but that's really only a small part of what we're talking about. The real action in this area is going to happen at the local level, in cities and in townships, because city and township governments fund and supervise police departments. Some folks are coming around to the realization that police are just forced to deal with problems that they're actually ill-equipped to deal with and really don't want to deal with at all. Why do we ask police to deal with the problems of drug addiction and homelessness in our community? They are not set up to do that. They don't want to do that. But we call police when we don't know who else to call, right? And they carry a heavy load, and they do what they're asked. So police are contending with social problems which really demand other solutions, smarter solutions. And there are smarter ways to get at these problems. We could embed social workers in our police departments to respond to domestic violence situations where there's no immediate danger of life or limb, right? For example. And over the long term, we could address these other societal problems with better programs. And when we cure those problems, there's less demand on our police departments, freeing up resources in a virtuous cycle. Now, depending on where you're registered to vote, it may be that these issues are not even on the radar of your elected officials. But I promise you, if you live in a small community, City of Adrian, Township of Adrian, Meridian Township where I live, if you call or talk to your local elected officials, they are going to hear you. There just are not that many votes, and every one matters to them. Or better yet, run for office yourself. In Michigan, to get on the ballot for a township election, you can gather signatures, or you can pay $100 at your local municipal building, and you're on the ballot. And even if you don't win, you advance your ideas just by being in the conversation. Bernie Sanders ran for president and lost twice, but now Medicare for all, whatever you think of it, is a mainstream idea. Considered fringe just a short time ago. The way changes like this happen and the way we fulfill the big promises the Constitution makes are for each of us to show up and do our part and make them happen. And if I were to amend President Obama's other earlier mentioned comment, I would say nothing can stand in the way of the power of millions of people working for change. In 1853, Theodore Parker said he couldn't see far along the arc of the moral universe, but he took a hopeful view of it. To my eye, since then, the path maybe hasn't been so much of an arc as a winding road, with some right turns and some wrong ones. In the future, I have every confidence we can bend that path towards justice, if that's the path we choose.
Thanks, Mr. DeGroff. That was really interesting. I appreciate it a lot. I have some questions for you, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay. First, you work at the state Supreme Court. What little-known fact should students know about what justices do there?
The little-known fact is that so many so many of what actually governs your day-to-day life is actually governed at the state level and not the federal level. We hear it's so much easier to be captured by the United States Supreme Court. Certainly those decisions are meaningful, but so many things like the vast majority of criminal convictions are handled at the state Supreme Court level. All matters of education policy are more or less matters of state concern, and when legal disputes arise about them, they come to our court. It's really an extremely important and fascinating part of the country's judicial system.
Supreme Court justices in Michigan are elected. Are they politicians?
That might be better addressed to one of them, but honestly, I don't think so. I think that from inside the court, I can tell you that the justices and the law clerks, the other staff that participates in the process, take the work extremely seriously. There are as many different ideological starting points to any conversation as there are people in the conversation, and that's true in the conversation we're having here, and that's true in the conversations amongst the justices. But I think, from what I can see, justices are trying to get the cases right, for whatever that means to them.
You mentioned that Americans revere the Constitution. Are the protests against brutality in our streets today attacks on the Constitution or vindications of it?
In my view, they're vindications of it, right? In my view, these are people showing up to vindicate the promises of the Constitution, right? The protests are not objections to freedom. They are, or to the promise of the Constitution. They're pleas for those promises to be kept. They're illustrations that many people in our society don't feel like they're being kept for them.
You said that lawyers and judges in criminal cases that you've seen interview prospective jurors often caution them by not presuming the truthfulness of police. Is that cautioning still necessary in light of the new consciousness that we've seen in 2020 about police misconduct?
And let me be clear. I don't think this is what you meant, but I don't want to give the impression that judges or lawyers caution jurors not to believe police, but that they should evaluate their credibility as they might any other witness, right? And, you know, do people have a different view of police today? It seems to me, and I can only speak, you know, anecdotally from my conversations with other people, it seems to me that people are surprised by a lot of the videos that they've seen. And I think that this is kind of a weird time in our country where we have a moment to stop and think about these things. With the pandemic, all of our lives are sort of slowed down, you know? There are not as many soccer games to take kids to and other activities. People have a minute to think about it. And I think that has given us time to examine some of the assumptions that we've made. So I can't say, to be honest, how that's coming out, you know, in terms of the average perceptions of jurors, having not read. I guess we'll see about that in transcripts for, you know, trials that are happening today and next year and the year after, and we'll see that in the years to come.
Has the court been affected, or to what extent is the court aware of what's been going on in the streets in 2020? I mean, does that affect the work that they do, the awareness of social unrest?
You mean the Michigan Supreme Court?
Yeah, the court where you work, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Most of the work that the court deals with is not, I mean, everything today is sort of influenced by the pandemic, right? And even how trials are happening in courthouses across the state is influenced by the pandemic. But, you know, in terms of, but I guess what I'm trying to say is much of the work of the court just doesn't deal specifically with it. So I can tell you that justices take very seriously the idea that, you know, litigation is an adversarial-based system, and everyone tries to confine themselves to the information and arguments presented by the parties.
So even though, you know, there may be protests right outside the courthouse or in downtown Lansing, and you know, the court is determined to do its business as it otherwise would. It wouldn't take, you know, this, you know, sort of profound moment of change, both in terms of the public's relationship with the police as well as the pandemic. You know, it's business as usual for the court.
It's important that the courts stay open and do their work, that's for sure. And courts have, you know, courts have paused, and trial courts across the state closed, but they're briefly, but they're open now and doing their work. And I think it's true. I think it's true that courts always are sort of aware of big moments, and this is one of those. But you know, I guess I can't really speak directly to I think what you're asking.
Well, yeah. Is this an especially exciting time to work at the Supreme Court? I mean, 2020 is a historical year, and you're there, you know, in that building, and you've worked at the Supreme Court in the past. You know, is this an especially exciting year in terms of the cases the court hears? Is this a different type of year?
There are pandemic-related cases this year, but there are big cases in the Michigan Supreme Court every year, and that's part of what makes it a fascinating place to work. The nature of the job is that 100 to 200 litigants might seek leave to appeal in the court every month. And of course, the court can't take all of those cases and issue opinion on all of those cases. And so the nature of the work is that the most interesting and important ones are filtered to the top, and we do as much of that work as we can. And every year the court is presented with interesting and challenging cases.
The U.S. is a nation politically divided. Some states blue, others red, but both colors seem to be pretty angry right now. Can the Constitution constrain the fury on both sides and keep the peace, do you think?
I don't think that's its role. I mean, the First Amendment, the freedom of speech guarantee, I think the idea behind it is that we don't constrain ideas and we don't constrain views. And if we're all paying attention and we're all being diligent, the best ideas will filter to the top. We could have a whole nother discussion about that and about the amount of information in our society and what people are doing with it, right? But I don't think the Constitution is designed to do that. I think that's our job.
One last question, if that's okay. And I ask this question on behalf of students who are interested in attending law school and perhaps even aspire to work at the Supreme Court one day. What's your advice to them? What should they do to prepare, to become a successful, conscientious lawyer and then maybe someday a Supreme Court justice?
There are a wide variety of backgrounds and preparations which people can bring to the law which are valuable. If you study philosophy or history as an undergrad or even a hard science, these are all things that can complement your intellectual growth and can help you as a law student and later as a lawyer. I think and so there are lots of paths you can take to be a successful law student, be a successful lawyer. I think the one bit of advice that I think is universally true, though, is to be interested and diligent. It can be, the law is, different pursuits are fascinating for different people. I find the law fascinating. It's the right thing for me. Some people find law school to be a bit of a slog, right? And that makes it hard to do the work in a diligent manner. So, but if you do find the law fascinating, and if this really is the pursuit for you, I think just be interested in it and explore it, and take the opportunities you have to do something outside the box, creative internships with law firms or anything tangentially related to the law, and that will inform all of that, your later experiences in a great way.
Thank you very much for coming today. It was excellent. It was fascinating. We hope to have you back again someday. And thanks to everyone who watched our Philip J. Prygoski Constitutional Address. We appreciate you. Oh, there's my camera. I'm a novice, everyone. All right, thanks for viewing today. Next year, I hope you'll all join us in person if possible. Thanks a lot.